Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Andrea Kita, and today I will be talking about the supernatural. It's one of my favorite areas of folklore to talk about, just because it is really fun and it's something that a lot of other disciplines don't cover, or if they do, they do it really in this context of condemnation. They don't really talk about it as a serious field of study or a serious thing that a lot of us engage in. So it's always just kind of like thrown aside, blown off as not a serious topic. And I love that folklore treats it like it's a real topic, because it is a real topic. So if we're thinking about it in terms of folklore, just to kind of situate ourselves a little bit in the genre, think of folklore as the big umbrella term. Belief is kind of what we're looking at in this. And sometimes belief is put under a larger umbrella term of customary folklore. That's fine, but I want you to think about it in terms of belief. And I love that we as folklorists categorize the supernatural as a belief, because you have belief is that big term, you have the supernatural underneath it, but also underneath that is medicine. And I love that about folklore, is that we put medicine and the supernatural under the same umbrella term of belief. Because these are all things that we believe in, and that's true of medicine as well. Medicine is actually a belief system. I'll get into that in another video. But anyway, let's talk about the supernatural. So the way that folklore approaches the supernatural is they take out that whole concept of proving it right or wrong. Because in some ways it doesn't really matter if the supernatural is true or not true. What matters is that we believe it's true, right? So to us, we don't really get into those debates about, do ghosts really exist? In part because there's no way for us to know that. And when you ask the question, do ghosts exist? What you're fundamentally asking is, what happens to us when we die? And that's a little bit it's not a topic I can necessarily cover in a semester or probably ever. So, that's like the big human question, right? What happens to us when we die? It's a little bit big of a topic. So let's just go with the supernatural and talk about it in those terms of what if. What if, as an intellectual exercise, we say, yes, ghosts are real. What happens then? What does that leave open for us to look at? What does that leave open for us to talk about? And I think that's so cool about folklore, is that we get to talk about it in these terms where we're thinking about it as not right or wrong, but as this is a thing that happens, and let's talk about it. So that's how folklorists approach the supernatural. We're not out there trying to disprove anything. We're not out there ghost hunting, although folklorists certainly ghost hunt as well. That's not our main focus. Our focus is to really talk about, what do these stories say? What do they mean about culture? What do they mean about individuals and people who tell the stories? There's so much there if we actually just take out that is it true or not question, right? So that's kind of how folklorists look at it, is as this larger topic that we're not going to debate whether or not it's real, because honestly, that's the least interesting part of the supernatural, right? So let me give you some definitions for the supernatural that I like to use. One of them is that it's a frame of reference with its own order. So the supernatural has a frame of reference. We know that there are rules about the supernatural, but it has an order that's a little bit different than the one that we are used to in our everyday reality. And I hate to say it in that way too, in our everyday reality, because for a lot of people, the supernatural is an everyday reality. But for the sake of argument, let's just use it as sort of what we kind of jointly conceive of as reality, right? So frame of reference with its own order. It's different from the physical world, but it interacts with it. So we know that the supernatural interacts in a different way than other types of physical things. I can pick up this pencil, and that is a physical thing, right? But the supernatural, I can't just like touch a ghost, right? So that's kind of how it interacts a little bit differently. That's just one example, but there's many, many more that hopefully I will get a chance to get into. And then we also kind of think about it as something that's a little bit beyond our current understanding. That's kind of what the term supernatural means, right? It's just beyond what we know to be natural, or beyond what we know to be normal, which is why some people like the term paranormal a little bit better, because it's just outside of what exists as normal. And if you use that categorization, well, then just about everything's paranormal, because what is normal anyway? So it's pretty interesting to think about it in those terms and use that as an intellectual exercise. The other thing I want to kind of address is this whole problem with why other disciplines don't really talk about the supernatural, or why they kind of don't feel like it's a topic that's worthy of discussion. And a lot of this has to do with kind of how we perceive the universe and the world, but it also goes back to even Descartes. So Descartes had, you might remember him, he's the I think therefore I am guy. Cartesian rationalism is a thing. So we have this idea that comes from Descartes that if you can't know for sure, then it's not worth talking about. And that's straight from Descartes. He actually believed that something was either true, false, provable, unprovable, empirical, verifiable, those kind of things. So if it doesn't fall into those categories, if we can't recreate the situation and make it happen more than once, then it can't be real. And as you notice, if you've heard some of these terminologies that I've been using, you're probably like, hey, that sounds familiar. Yeah, it's called the scientific method. So we try to apply the scientific method to a lot of different things. And that's kind of problematic because the scientific method doesn't always work with everything, especially when we're talking about people, right? People can do a lot of very interesting things, and we're not terribly empirical and verifiable, right? You can put the same person in the same situation and we'll make a different decision every time because we don't work like that. We're not like combining chemicals in a lab or something along those lines. We're weird and messy, and that kind of makes us awesome too. But like we just don't work like that. So this kind of thought pattern when it comes to talking about human beings doesn't really work all the time. Also, it's definitely not going to work if we're dead. So if you imagine how weird and messy human beings are on like everyday basis, imagine how much worse we are if we're dead, right? We're confused, we don't know what's going on. How could we possibly fit within the scientific method? But that's what we use as kind of the gold standard. Like things have to be, repeatable. They have to be empirical. They have to happen the same way over and over again for us to consider it knowledge or for us to consider it real. And that's just not how it works, right? That's just not what people are like. And this is true in other areas of science too. If you start to think about things like medicine and you start to think about like, oh, well, why do people have different interactions with the same drug? Because we're complicated, right? So you can't just have everything be exact in that sort of way. But we really want that, especially when we're talking about things that we teach formally. We want our formal knowledge to be empirical, verifiable. We want it to be consistent. That's not the way it works in these topics. And I think that's true of other disciplines as well. But we're still, here's our first ghost. We're still haunted by that idea, right? We want our knowledge to be a certain way. And when it doesn't fit that way, then we tend to say, well, it's not true, or we tend to ignore it, which is exactly what happens with the supernatural. So that's one of the things we're haunted by in the study of the supernatural, right? Is this idea that it has to act in a certain way in order for us to even think that it's real. I think some of the other problems we have too with this is that we're taught to believe certain things, right? So certain beliefs are okay and other beliefs are not okay. And this actually goes back to a folklore scholar named David Hufford. And David Hufford had what he called both the traditions of belief and the traditions of disbelief. So just as it's traditional to believe in certain things, the traditions of belief, it's also traditional to not believe in certain things. So disbelief is also traditional. So he was kind of looking at it and saying like, hey, it's not just believing in certain things, it's also disbelief that's traditional. So it might be okay for you to, according to your family tradition, to believe in a deity. And you might have a specific name for that deity. And it might be okay for you to feel like that deity is communicating with you in some way. However, a line might be drawn, depending on your family, depending on your culture, if you see that deity, right? It might be okay to feel like, that deity is speaking to you through nature or through interactions with the world or through coincidences. That might be okay. But if you're having breakfast with that deity, now we've crossed the line, right? So that can be problematic for a lot of people. That there is a line where it's okay to believe, but then there's like a line that you cross, and that is very culturally based. For some people, they're like, no, that's okay. You can also do that. So our interactions with the supernatural, be they deities, be they angels, demons, whatever, ghosts, all of those things in our interaction with them is really culturally determined. What's appropriate, what's inappropriate according to our culture. The other thing I'm going to say right now, some of you are freaking out because I have just equated your very real belief in God to a belief in the supernatural. That's the way folklorists do it, because if we start making a hierarchy of your belief is more important than somebody else's belief, now we've got a problem, right? So if we just create all beliefs as equal, that makes it a lot easier for us to talk about, and it really takes out some inherent bias that we might have as individuals. So if your belief in ghosts and your belief in the supernatural and your belief in God or angels or anything else, if we talk about those as all being equal, it helps us as scholars make sure that our inherent bias isn't showing, but it also just makes it make a lot more sense to do it that way. So it's not that we're saying that anybody's belief is better or worse than anyone else's belief. And I think that's really important in this, because we don't want to start saying like your belief is more or less important than somebody else's. All beliefs are equal in the study of this, and especially as the way folklorists see it. And I think that's actually a really cool other thing that folklorists do, because a lot of times some people will equate all of those beliefs or give them a sort of hierarchy. And I don't think we should give them a hierarchy. We should all treat them as equal. And additionally, we don't know the level of belief that an individual has in each of these things. So you probably believe in certain things more than other things. And that's okay, that's normal. So we don't want to assume what your level of belief is until you tell us, as we do an interview with you or we're talking with you as a folklorist. I wouldn't want to assume how much you believe or disbelieve in something unless I talk to you about it first. So if I don't know, I'm not going to assign any sort of level of belief for you. And I think that's the best way to handle it. So it's not that we're saying that all of these beliefs are trivial. They're all very equally important, but we're saying they're equally important. We're not saying, oh, your belief in this is higher than somebody else's belief. We don't want to make those kind of assumptions. So that's another way to kind of think about it that I think is also interesting, the way the folklorists approach this. I've got a lot more to say about this, but I'm trying to keep these videos short, so I'm going to stop for there.